The silk curtains hung motionless in the summer heat of 1597. Somewhere deep within the labyrinth of palace, behind doors guarded by men who could never father children, a girl sat perfectly still. Her name was Sultan. She was 14 years old. In 3 days, she would be married to a man she had never spoken to, a military commander 42 years her senior who had killed more men than she had seen sunrises. But it was not the stranger that terrified her. It was not the age difference or the cold political calculation behind the match. What made her hands tremble as she stared at her reflection in the bronze mirror was something else entirely. Something the poets never sang about. Something the chroniclers never dared to write. The women around her moved like shadows, preparing her body, preparing her mind, preparing her for what they called the sacred threshold. They spoke in whispers, as if the walls themselves might punish them for speaking plainly. One of them, an elderly woman whose face bore the map of 70 winters, leaned close to Seir and said something that made the girl's breath catch in her throat. We do not know exactly what those words were. The Ottoman archives contain no record of them. But we know what happened next. Began to weep. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a nervous bride, but the desperate, choking sobs of someone who had just learned they were about to be devoured. This is not a story about romance. This is not a tale of beautiful gowns and golden jewelry and celebrated unions. This is about what happened when the doors closed, when the music stopped, when the empire demanded its price from the daughters of sultans. And that price, whispered about for centuries in the dark corners of palaces across 3 continents, was paid in blood, in silence, and in shattered minds that never fully healed. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 14 million square kilometers at its peak. It ruled over lands from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the steppes of Ukraine to the shores of North Africa. For over 600 years, it stood as one of the most formidable powers the world had ever seen. Its armies were legendary. Its wealth was incalculable. Its sultans commanded the loyalty of millions, but empires are not built on conquest alone. They are built on alliances, on marriages, on the bodies of young women who had no choice in the matter. Ottoman princesses were born into unimaginable luxury. They lived in palaces filled with fountains that ran with, gardens where nightingales sang among jasmine blossoms, rooms adorned with carpets so fine it took craftsmen 3 years to weave a single one. They wore silk imported from China, jewels plucked from mines in Persia, perfumes blended by masters in Alexandria. They were educated by the finest scholars, taught multiple languages, trained in music and poetry and calligraphy. To the outside world, they appeared to be the most fortunate women on earth. But every single one of them knew the truth. From the moment they could understand language, they knew. Their beauty was not their own. Their intelligence was not their own. Their very existence was not their own. They belonged to the empire. And when the time came, they would be given away like treaty documents, signed and sealed and delivered to men chosen not for kindness or compatibility, but for strategic value. The daughters of sultans were currency, and currency must be spent. Selection of a husband for an imperial princess followed a brutal logic. The man chosen was never a rival to the throne, never someone who might use the marriage to claim power for himself. Instead, he was typically a high-ranking military officer or government official, someone already loyal to the sultan, someone whose loyalty could be deepened and secured through the bond of marriage. Age was irrelevant. Compatibility was never considered. Love was a word that did not appear in the negotiations. What mattered was the empire. When a princess reached what was considered marriageable age, usually between 12 and 16, the sultan would announce his decision. There was no discussion, no consultation with the girl herself. She would learn her fate the same way everyone else did, through official proclamation. From that moment, her life ceased to belong to her. She entered what might be called the preparation phase, though that term is far too gentle for what actually occurred. The preparation lasted anywhere from 3 months to a full year, depending on the importance of the match and the complexity of the political situation. During this time, the princess was moved to a separate section of the palace, isolated from almost everyone she had known. Her education shifted. No more poetry, no more astronomy, no more debates with scholars about philosophy or history. Instead, she was taught what the empire called the duties of a wife. But these were not the domestic skills you might imagine. This was something far more specific, far more invasive, far more designed to break the human spirit. The women who oversaw this training were not teachers. They were architects of obedience. Most of them were former slaves who had risen through the ranks of the imperial harem, women who had survived by learning to submit, by mastering the art of pleasing men who held absolute power over their lives. Now they would pass that knowledge on, whether the princess wanted it or not. The training began with the body. The princess was placed on a strict regimen designed to alter her physically. Certain foods were forbidden. Others were required in specific quantities. Herbal mixtures were prepared, drinks that smelled of cardamom and tasted of bitter earth, concoctions that the women claimed would make her more fertile, more docile, more pleasing to her future husband. Modern historians who have studied the ingredients of these mixtures have identified compounds that would have acted as mild sedatives, substances that induced a state of calm compliance, that dulled anxiety and resistance. Whether the women who prepared them understood the pharmacology or simply followed recipes passed down through generations, the effect was the same. The princess began to move through her days in a kind of fog, present but not fully aware, compliant but not fully conscious. Bathing rituals were equally invasive. Multiple times each day, the princess was taken to the bathhouse where she was scrubbed and oiled and perfumed by hands that were not gentle. Every part of her body was inspected, evaluated, critiqued. Imperfections were noted, corrections were made. Hair was removed from places she had never thought about. Oils were massaged into skin until it gleamed. Scents were applied with such intensity that she could taste them in the back of her throat. The message was clear. Your body is not yours. It is being prepared for someone else. It must be perfect for him. But the physical preparation was only the beginning. The psychological conditioning was far more insidious. The princess was required to practice what were called the rituals of reverence. She would kneel for hours, holding specific positions until her legs cramped and her back screamed. She would practice walking with her eyes lowered, never looking directly at anyone, especially not a man. She would rehearse phrases of submission, repeating them until they became automatic, until she could say them without thinking, without feeling. Thank you for your kindness. I exist to serve you. My purpose is your contentment. Forgive my inadequacy. I am grateful for your patience. Over and over, hundreds of times each day, until the words lost all meaning, until they became nothing more than sounds her mouth made without her mind's participation. The most disturbing aspect of the preparation, the element that survivors would later describe in coded language to their daughters and trusted servants, was what happened in the training chambers. These were rooms located in the oldest, deepest sections of the palace, far from the gardens and fountains, far from anywhere a scream might be heard by the wrong ears. The official term for what occurred there was instruction in marital duties. But that phrase concealed a reality so harsh that even hardened palace officials refused to discuss it openly. The princess was brought to these chambers accompanied by the senior women who had been overseeing her transformation. Inside, she would find life-sized figures, mannequins crafted with disturbing attention to anatomical detail. Some accounts suggest these figures were created by artisans brought in from Venice or Florence, masters of sculpture who understood human form with medical precision. The figures were positioned in various poses, and the princess was required to interact with them, to practice movements and responses that no child should ever have to rehearse. The women would demonstrate. Then the princess would be required to replicate what she had seen. Any hesitation was met with sharp words. Any sign of distress or resistance was recorded in ledgers that tracked her progress or lack thereof. The sessions could last for hours. When they finally ended, the princess would be returned to her chambers, where she would lie awake through the night, staring at ceiling frescoes that depicted scenes of paradise, wondering how heaven and hell could exist in the same building. There were punishments for those who resisted too openly. A princess who refused to participate in the training might find herself confined to a windowless room for days, with only bread and water, with only silence and darkness for company. A princess who spoke defiantly might be forced to serve the lowest-ranking women in the harem, to wash their feet and comb their hair and empty their chamber pots, a deliberate humiliation designed to crush any remaining pride. A princess who wept too much might be asleep, kept awake through the night by attendants who would splash cold water on her face whenever her eyes began to close. The empire had perfected these methods over centuries. They knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to offer a moment of kindness to prevent complete mental collapse, exactly how to break a human spirit without destroying the body that would soon be needed for producing heirs. It was a science, a terrible, precise science. As the wedding day approached, the princess would be allowed one final visit with her mother if her mother was still alive. These meetings were supervised, of course. Every word was heard by attendants who stood in the corners like statues. But sometimes, in those last moments, a mother would find a way to offer comfort. Not through words, which could be reported and punished, but through touch. A hand squeezed just a little too tightly. An embrace held just a few seconds too long. A look that said everything language could not. I know what you are about to endure. I survived it. You will survive it too, though what remains of you afterward may not recognize itself. Not all mothers could offer even that much. Some had been so thoroughly broken by their own experiences that they had become enforcers of the system, convinced that this was simply the way things must be, that resistance was not only futile but wrong. These mothers would spend the final visit lecturing their daughters about duty and obedience and the sacred responsibility of maintaining the empire's strength. They would repeat the same phrases that had been drilled into them decades earlier, words they no longer questioned because questioning would mean acknowledging what had been done to them, and that acknowledgement would shatter whatever fragile peace they had managed to construct. The wedding day itself was a performance of magnificent proportions. The entire city would be involved. Streets were decorated with flowers and silk banners. Musicians played from every corner. Dancers performed in the squares. The Sultan distributed gold coins to the poor, bread to the hungry, pardons to certain prisoners. It was meant to be a celebration of joy and prosperity, a demonstration of the empire's generosity and power. For the common people watching from behind barricades, it must have seemed like something from a fairy tale. A princess in jeweled robes, a powerful husband, a future filled with luxury and influence. They could not see her face beneath the veils. They could not see the way her hands trembled even though she had been given enough sedatives to calm a warhorse. They could not see the way she flinched whenever the music grew too loud, as if every drumbeat was a countdown to her doom. They could not know that beneath all the silk and gold and precious stones, there was a girl who had not eaten in 3 days because her stomach rejected everything. A girl who had not slept without nightmares in 3 months. A girl who had already begun the process of leaving her own body because staying present was too painful to bear. The ceremony could last for hours, sometimes for an entire day. There were blessings from religious leaders, readings from sacred texts, presentations of gifts from foreign ambassadors. The princess was required to sit perfectly still through all of it, her posture rigid, her expression neutral. She had been trained for this too, how to sit without moving, how to smile without meaning it, how to appear honored and grateful when every cell in her body was screaming for escape. If you enjoy uncovering the darkest truths hidden beneath the surface of history's grandest empires, consider subscribing and letting me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these untold stories to light. Finally, as the sun set and the public celebrations began to wind down, came the moment every princess had been taught to dread: the private procession. She would be escorted from the main ceremonial halls to the bridal chamber, a specially prepared room that had been blessed and perfumed and arranged according to ancient customs. The walk there was short in distance, but infinite in duration. Every step felt like walking toward an executioner's block. The women surrounding her would whisper encouragements, reminders of her training, warnings about the consequences of failure. Remember everything you have learned. Do not resist. Do not cry out. Do not shame your family. Do not dishonor the empire. The chamber itself was designed with symbolism in mind. Red silk covered the walls, representing fertility and the blood that would seal the marriage. Incense burned in silver vessels, filling the air with smoke that was meant to be sacred but felt suffocating. Cushions were arranged on the floor in specific patterns, each position holding meaning that had been explained during training. And in the center of it all, a bed, not the comfortable sleeping place of childhood, but a stage, a site of conquest. A location where empires were built on the bodies of girls who had never chosen any of this. The princess would be dressed in specific garments. Thin, white, easily removed. Her hair would be arranged in a particular style, adorned with flowers that would be crushed before the night was over. Jewelry would be placed on her wrists and ankles, not for beauty but for tradition, each piece carrying the weight of centuries of women who had worn them before, women whose names were forgotten but whose suffering echoed through time. And then the women would leave, not all of them. Some would remain just outside the door, listening, making sure the marriage was consummated, making sure the princess fulfilled her duty. Privacy was an illusion. Even in this most intimate moment, the empire was watching. The husband would enter. He had his own preparation, though far less brutal. He had been advised by older men about how to approach the situation, reminded that this was not just about personal satisfaction, but about asserting dominance, about establishing the hierarchy that would define the marriage from this moment forward. Some men approached with cruelty, viewing the night as an opportunity to demonstrate power over a girl who came from a bloodline higher than their own. Others approached with indifference, seeing it as a political duty to be completed as efficiently as possible. Very few approached with any thought for the terror they were about to inflict. What happened next is documented only in fragments, in euphemisms, in medical reports that used clinical language to describe trauma. Palace physicians would be summoned afterward to verify that the marriage had been consummated, to examine the princess and confirm what needed to be confirmed. Their reports, still preserved in archives, use phrases like necessary completion and appropriate signs and fulfillment of marital obligation. But between those sterile words, you can read the truth. Bleeding that exceeded normal expectations, injuries that required treatment, shock so severe that the princess could not speak for days afterward. Some princesses fainted, some went into convulsions, some simply stared at nothing, their minds having retreated to some unreachable place where the horror could not follow. The physicians would prescribe remedies, herbal poultices for physical wounds, opium-based drinks for emotional distress, rest in darkened rooms, but there was no remedy for what had truly been broken, no herb that could restore a sense of safety. No amount of rest that could undo the knowledge that this would be your life now, that your body was not your sanctuary, but a battlefield where the empire waged its wars. The morning after the wedding night, there would be another ceremony. The blood-stained sheets would be displayed to certain officials as proof that the princess had been a virgin, that the marriage was legitimate, that the alliance was sealed. This display, meant to be a moment of honor, was in reality a final humiliation. The most private evidence of the most traumatic experience of her young life, held up for examination by strangers who nodded approvingly before moving on to discuss trade agreements and military campaigns. The days following the wedding night revealed the true cost of what had occurred. Palace records, though carefully sanitized, contain hints of what physicians and attendants witnessed. Princesses who refused to eat, their bodies rejecting nourishment as if food itself had become an enemy. Princesses who could not sleep, who would wake screaming from nightmares so vivid that guards stationed 3 corridors away could hear them. Princesses who developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, but what Ottoman doctors recorded as disorder or hysteria of the womb. The treatment offered was worse than useless. Some physicians believed that bloodletting would balance the humors and restore mental equilibrium, so they would open veins and drain cups of blood from girls already weakened by shock and malnutrition. Others prescribed isolation, believing that solitude would allow the princess to adjust to her new reality, not understanding that isolation only deepened the psychological damage. Still others recommended forced cheerfulness, insisting that the princess attend social gatherings and smile and pretend that everything was wonderful, a performance that required whatever remaining energy she had left. A few princesses never recovered at all. The archives contain death records that are suspiciously vague. A princess who died at age 16, just months after marriage, attributed to sudden fever. Another at 17 from unexplained weakness. Another at 19 from what physicians called a failure of the heart, though she had shown no signs of cardiac problems before her wedding. Modern historians examining these cases have noted patterns consistent with death by suicide or death from the physical complications of severe psychological trauma. But the empire never used those words. To acknowledge such deaths would be to acknowledge that the system itself was lethal. Those who survived the initial trauma faced a different kind of death, the slow erasure of personality, the gradual disappearance of everything that had made them unique. The girl who had once debated philosophy with scholars now sat silently at banquets, her eyes focused on nothing. The girl who had once played the oud with such skill that grown men wept now kept her hands folded in her lap, never touching an instrument again. The girl who had once written poetry that circulated among the educated elite now refused to hold a pen, as if the very act of creation had become unbearable. Their husbands, for the most part, did not care about this transformation. They had not married for companionship or intellectual stimulation. They had married for political advancement and the production of heirs. As long as the princess fulfilled those functions, her internal state was irrelevant. Some husbands were away on military campaigns for months or years at a time, returning only long enough to impregnate their wives before departing again. Others maintained multiple households, spending most of their time with concubines who had not been broken by the imperial training system, women who could still laugh and flirt and pretend to enjoy their company. The princess would remain in her designated quarters, surrounded by servants who reported her every movement to palace officials. She would be required to appear at certain ceremonies, dressed in appropriate finery, displaying the appearance of contentment. She would bear children, usually many of them, each pregnancy further weakening her already fragile health. She would grow older, but she would never grow into herself, because the self she might have become had been destroyed on her wedding night and in all the preparation that led up to it. Some princesses found small rebellions. They would embroider hidden messages into clothing, symbols that other women might recognize and understand. They would develop elaborate internal worlds, fantasy lives where they had power and freedom and choice. They would form intense bonds with female servants or other trapped women, relationships that provided some measure of emotional sustenance in an otherwise barren existence. These tiny acts of resistance did not change their circumstances, but they allowed some princesses to maintain a sense that they still existed, that they had not been completely erased. Others turned to substances. Opium was readily available in the Ottoman Empire, used medicinally but also recreationally by those who could afford it. For a princess trapped in unbearable psychological pain, opium offered temporary escape. It dulled the memories. It softened the sharp edges of reality. It made the hours pass more quickly. But it also created dependency, and that dependency gave even more power to those who controlled access to the drug. A princess who had become addicted could be managed more easily, kept compliant through the careful regulation of her supply. Some husbands actively encouraged this, preferring a wife who was sedated and passive to one who might still harbor traces of spirit. There were a handful of cases where princesses attempted to escape their situations through legal means. Ottoman law did allow for divorce under certain circumstances, though the process was heavily weighted against women. A princess seeking divorce would need to prove abuse beyond what was considered normal marital discipline, or demonstrate that her husband had failed to provide for her, or show that he had committed some serious breach of Islamic law. Even then, her case would be heard by judges who were themselves part of the system that had arranged the marriage in the first place, men who had no interest in undermining imperial policy by granting divorces to unhappy princesses. The few princesses who succeeded in obtaining divorces found that freedom came with its own punishments. They would be returned to the imperial palace, but not to their former status. They would be housed in sections reserved for women who had failed in their duties, areas that were less comfortable, less prestigious, more clearly marked as places of shame. They would be forbidden from remarrying, lest they cause embarrassment by seeking happiness a second time. They would be watched constantly, their movements restricted, their correspondence monitored, their very existence a warning to other princesses about what happened when you tried to defy your fate. And yet, despite all of this suffering, despite the documented evidence of trauma and death and destroyed lives, the system continued for centuries. Why? Because the empire needed it. The marriages of princesses were too valuable as political tools. They secured alliances that prevented wars. They bound powerful families to the throne. They created networks of loyalty that extended across the vast territories the Sultan controlled. From the perspective of imperial strategy, the cost of a few broken girls was negligible compared to the benefits of political stability. The women who ran the training programs, who supervised the preparation, who enforced the rituals of submission, were themselves victims who had become perpetrators. They had survived by learning to inflict on others what had been inflicted on them. They had convinced themselves that this was necessary, that this was natural, that this was the only way to prepare a girl for the reality of marriage in an empire where women were property. To question the system would have been to question their own survival, to acknowledge that they had been broken and had then broken others in turn. That kind of self-examination was too painful. It was easier to believe the lie, that this was normal, that this was right, that this was how things had always been and always would be. But there were cracks in the foundation, whispered conversations between mothers and daughters, letters smuggled out of the palace by sympathetic servants, foreign visitors who witnessed ceremonies and left accounts that, while incomplete and filtered through their own cultural biases, preserved fragments of truth that the official histories tried to erase. European ambassadors wrote back to their governments expressing shock at what they glimpsed behind the public spectacle. Venetian merchants who did business in Istanbul carried stories back across the Mediterranean. Ottoman subjects from minority communities kept their own records, sometimes more honest than the imperial archives. These scattered accounts, pieced together by modern historians, reveal a pattern that extended beyond just the Ottoman Empire. Across cultures and centuries, wherever women were used as political currency, wherever marriages were arranged for strategic rather than personal reasons, similar horrors occurred. The specifics varied. The rituals differed. The justifications were culturally particular, but the underlying reality was the same. Young women were sacrificed to maintain systems of power that benefited everyone except them. In some cases, the suffering was acknowledged but framed as noble sacrifice. In others, it was simply hidden behind walls and veils and carefully crafted public narratives. But the women themselves knew. The mothers knew what awaited their daughters. The daughters knew what had happened to their mothers. The servants knew what they witnessed in the private chambers. The physicians knew what they treated in the aftermath. Everyone knew. They just agreed, through a combination of fear and complicity and hopelessness, not to speak of it openly. The Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in the early 20th century, swept away by forces of modernization and nationalism and the catastrophic losses of the First World War. The Sultanate was abolished. The palaces were transformed into museums. The imperial family was sent into exile. The systems that had governed the lives of princesses for 600 years ceased to exist. But the women who had suffered under those systems were not granted justice or acknowledgement. Their stories remained buried in archives, coded in euphemisms, dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings by historians who found it more comfortable to focus on military campaigns and diplomatic achievements. It has taken generations of scholars, many of them women who recognized in these old documents the echoes of their own experiences with patriarchal control, to begin reconstructing what actually happened. They have sifted through medical records that describe injuries without naming their cause. They have analyzed architectural plans of palaces, noting the isolated chambers and soundproofed rooms. They have studied the language used in marriage contracts, the careful legal phrasing that stripped women of autonomy while pretending to protect them. They have interviewed descendants of palace servants, collecting oral histories that were never supposed to be preserved. What emerges from this research is devastating in its clarity. The Ottoman Empire did not create an entirely unique system of oppression. Rather, it perfected techniques that existed in various forms across many cultures. The specific rituals might have been Ottoman, but the underlying logic, that women's bodies and minds could be shaped and controlled to serve state interests, was universal among patriarchal power structures. The training chambers of palace were not so different in purpose from the instruction given to aristocratic girls in European courts, or to young women in Chinese imperial families, or to daughters of ruling dynasties anywhere that politics and marriage intertwined. The difference was perhaps one of degree and documentation. The Ottoman system was remarkably thorough, and enough evidence survived to allow modern researchers to reconstruct it in disturbing detail. Other empires may have been equally brutal, but they left fewer traces, or those traces have not yet been uncovered, or the languages and cultural contexts make them harder to interpret. What we know about Ottoman princesses opens a window into a broader truth about how empires functioned, how they extracted compliance from those born into power but any actual autonomy. Consider the life of Sultan, daughter of Sultan I, who was married at age 13 to a general named Pasha in 1616. Ottoman chronicles describe the wedding as magnificent, lasting 5 days, with festivities that cost the imperial treasury the equivalent of 3 years of revenue from entire provinces. But Venetian diplomatic reports from the same period mention that the young princess had to be carried to her bridal chamber because she could not walk, that physicians were present throughout the night, and that she remained in seclusion for 2 months afterward due to undisclosed injuries. Lived for 34 more years after that night. She bore 4 children. She appeared at state functions when required. But private letters that survived in family archives, discovered only in recent decades, reveal a woman who wrote obsessively about wanting to disappear, about feeling as though her body was a cage she could not escape, about nights when she could not breathe because the memories suffocated her. In one letter to her sister, she wrote that she the women who had died young before their wedding nights, because they had been spared the knowledge that would haunt her until her final breath. Or consider Sultan, married in 1657 at age 15. Official records state that she died 3 years later from complications of childbirth, but a physician's private journal found in a French archive and only recently translated, tells a different story. The doctor wrote that the princess had deliberately starved herself during pregnancy, refusing food despite all attempts to force her to eat. He described her as having lost her reason, speaking to people who were not there, alternating between violent rages and complete catatonia. When she died, he wrote, it was a mercy, because what remained of her could no longer be called a person. These were not isolated cases. The pattern repeats across generations. Princess after princess, wedding after wedding, the same trajectory. Initial trauma, failed recovery attempts, gradual disintegration of personality, early death or decades of hollow survival. The machinery of empire ground them up and discarded the pieces, then found new girls to feed into the same mechanism. And through it all, the public narrative remained unchanged. Ottoman princesses lived lives of unimaginable luxury and privilege. They were throughout the world. They wanted for nothing. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. How could an empire simultaneously celebrate these women and destroy them? How could a culture that produced extraordinary poetry and art and philosophy also produce training chambers where girls were broken like horses? The answer lies in the fundamental logic of patriarchal power. Women in such systems are not fully human. They are resources. They are tools. They are vessels for producing heirs and cementing alliances. Their suffering matters only insofar as it interferes with their functionality. A princess who is traumatized but still produces children and maintains appearances has fulfilled her purpose. Her internal anguish is irrelevant. This dehumanization was reinforced through religious and philosophical frameworks that insisted women were naturally inferior, naturally suited for submission, naturally fulfilled through service to husbands and empire. Any woman who suffered under this arrangement was framed as individually defective rather than as a victim of systemic violence. If a princess could not adjust to her married life, it was her personal failing, her weak character, her insufficient faith or devotion. The system itself was never questioned because the system was understood to be divinely ordained, natural, inevitable. But empires are not natural. They are constructed by human choices and maintained through human actions. Every element of the system that destroyed Ottoman princesses was created deliberately. The training programs were designed by people. The isolation protocols were established by people. The wedding night rituals were enforced by people. At every level, individuals made decisions that perpetuated suffering. And they made those decisions because maintaining imperial power was more important to them than the of individual women, even women of their own families. Some might argue that we cannot judge historical practices by modern standards, that what seems horrific to us now was normal for the time. But this argument collapses when you examine the sources more carefully. Even within Ottoman society, there were voices that expressed discomfort with these practices. Poems that alluded to the suffering of brides, medical texts that documented the psychological damage. Religious scholars who questioned whether the treatment of princesses was truly compatible with Islamic teachings about compassion and justice. The people of that era were capable of recognizing cruelty. They simply lacked the power or will to stop it. Moreover, the princesses themselves knew they were being harmed. Their letters, their desperate attempts at escape, their early deaths, all testify to the fact that this was not a neutral cultural practice they accepted without question. They knew what was being done to them was wrong. They just had no mechanism for resistance that would not result in even worse consequences. When every institution, family, religion, law, custom is aligned against you, when speaking out means punishment and compliance means survival, the choice is not really a choice at all. The legacy of this system extends beyond the Ottoman Empire and beyond the historical period in which it existed. The mechanisms of control perfected in places like Palace, the psychological techniques of breaking and rebuilding a person's sense of self, the use of isolation and ritual and punishment to create compliance, these methods did not disappear when the empire fell. They evolved. They adapted. They appear in different forms in different contexts, but the underlying logic remains. Control women's bodies. Control women's minds. Use them for purposes they did not choose. Call it tradition or duty or natural order. But never ever acknowledge the violence inherent in the system. Understanding this history is not about condemning the past from a position of moral superiority. It is about recognizing patterns that persist. It is about seeing how systems of power operate, how they justify themselves, how they get ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty. It is about understanding that the women who suffered in Ottoman palaces are connected to women who suffer today under different systems that employ similar logic. The details change. The core remains. When we uncover these hidden histories, when we insist on speaking the truth that empires tried to bury, we are not simply satisfying curiosity about the past. We are equipping ourselves to recognize and resist oppression in the present. We are honoring the women whose names were written in water, whose suffering was dismissed, whose voices were silenced. We are saying that their lives mattered, that what was done to them was wrong, and that remembering is itself an act of resistance against all the forces that prefer we forget. The daughters of sultans feared their wedding nights because they had been taught, through systematic brutality disguised as preparation, exactly what awaited them. They feared because the empire demanded their bodies as tribute and their silence as complicity. They feared because they understood with a clarity that their tormentors refused to acknowledge that the price of empire was paid in their flesh and their sanity and their souls. And they were right to fear, because everything they had been told would happen happened. And there was no escape, and there was no justice, and there was no acknowledgement, only the weight of centuries pressing down, crushing them into dust that would blow away and be forgotten. But we remember now, we pieced together the fragments, we read between the lines of sanitized histories, we listened to the echoes of screams that official chronicles tried to silence, and in remembering we bear witness. We say their names when we can find them, we honor their suffering by refusing to look away. And we commit ourselves to building a world where no girl will ever again have to fear what they feared, where power cannot demand such sacrifices, where every person's humanity is recognized and protected. The Ottoman Empire is gone, the palaces are museums, the training chambers are empty, but the questions remain. How many other princesses and how many other empires suffered in ways we have not yet uncovered? How many stories are still buried in archives we have not yet opened? How many women across history were destroyed by systems that claim to honor them? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Because only by confronting the full truth of history, in all its beauty and all its horror, can we hope to create a future that does not repeat the same patterns of violence and denial. If this story has affected you, if it has made you think differently about power and privilege and the hidden costs of empire, then share it. Let others know that history is not just about grand battles and famous rulers. It is also about the countless individuals whose lives were shaped and often destroyed by forces beyond their control. Subscribe to Master Historians for more explorations into the truths that official histories tried to bury. And tell us in the comments what other hidden stories you want uncovered, because the work of remembering is never finished, and the voices that were silenced deserve to be heard, even if it takes centuries for us to finally listen.